He looked directly at the committee and said no. Not "I don't recall." Not "I can't be certain." Just no, 3 times. 3 different members of Congress. 3 different versions of the same question. Did you ever delete an official record? No. Were you ever engaged in attempts to obstruct the release of public documents? No. Did you delete any emails related to the Wuhan lab? No, I did not. That was June 3rd, 2024. House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic. Washington, D.C. Fauci walked out of that room looking like a man who had survived everything. 4 years of accusations, dozens of hearings, Rand Paul across from him, again and again pressing the same argument. Nothing had landed. Nothing had stuck. And by every visible measure, Fauci had won. He was wrong about that, because Rand Paul had been reading documents that most of Washington wasn't paying attention to, and buried inside them was something that couldn't be explained away, not minimized, not deflected, not answered with a prepared statement. His own words. The first email was dated February 2nd, 2020, one day after what investigators now call the Proximal Origins Call, a private conference between the world's top virologists, including Fauci's closest scientific allies. What they were saying privately was very different from what they would say publicly. Privately, some wrote that the lab escape scenario was friggin' likely, that the molecular data was fully consistent with a lab origin, that they couldn't think of a plausible natural explanation. Then the Proximal Origin paper was published. It declared the lab theory implausible. The media ran with it, and anything that contradicted it was labeled misinformation. The very next morning after that call, Fauci wrote to the director of the National Institutes of Health. The message ended with 5 words. Please delete this email after you read it. The pandemic had barely begun, and the man responsible for guiding America's public health response was already asking the NIH director to destroy the record. So the question becomes obvious. Why? Why, one day after a private call where scientists were debating whether a deadly virus came from a lab, would Fauci instruct a colleague to erase their communication? What was in that email that couldn't survive being seen? But that wasn't the only one. 5 months later, July 20th, 2020, Fauci wrote to his own chief of staff. He referred to Rand Paul in language that would later appear in the congressional record. And at the end of that message, he gave the same instruction he had given in February. Please delete this email after you read it. 2 emails, same 5 words, written in his own name. And he had told Congress under oath that he had never done this. The room had no answer for that. Here is what made this different from every other accusation. Paul hadn't gotten this from a whistleblower. He hadn't gotten it from a journalist or a tip from inside the agency. The Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee had obtained these records through its own formal investigation, official documents, verified, authenticated. Fauci couldn't call it a conspiracy theory because the documents were his. But to understand why this moment landed the way it did, you have to go back 4 years to what Paul had actually been arguing and why almost nobody believed him. The NIH had funded a group called EcoHealth Alliance. EcoHealth had sent that money to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and the Wuhan lab had been running experiments on bat coronaviruses that Paul argued met the definition of gain-of-function research, work designed to make pathogens more dangerous. Fauci said Paul didn't know what he was talking about, on camera, under oath. Senator Paul, you do not know what you're talking about, quite frankly. Paul kept going anyway. What most people didn't know was what was happening behind closed doors at the exact same time. The scientists on that February 2020 call, the call that preceded Fauci's delete email, were privately expressing serious doubts about natural origin. One called the lab scenario so friggin' likely. Another cited molecular data fully consistent with it. Then, days later, they published a paper saying it was implausible. Private doubt, public denial, and emails asking colleagues to erase the record. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. In January 2025, Paul escalated in a way that changed the entire investigation. He issued subpoenas to 14 federal agencies simultaneously: the NIH, the FBI, the CIA, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, the NSA. He was done asking. He was requiring. And then Biden made a move that nobody had fully anticipated. 3 days before Trump's inauguration, Biden signed a preemptive pardon for Anthony Fauci. It covered all potential federal crimes committed between 2014 and the end of Fauci's career in December 2023. No charges, no indictment, no formal accusation. Biden signed it anyway. Think about what that means. You don't pardon someone for something that never happened. You don't shield a person from prosecution when there is nothing to prosecute. The pardon didn't declare Fauci innocent. It declared that whatever was in those records was serious enough to require protection before anyone could see it. Innocent people don't ask for preemptive pardons. They don't need them. Paul said exactly that, publicly, on the Senate floor. But then something happened that even the pardon didn't account for. September 2025. The emails surfaced. Paul went public immediately. He posted them on the Senate website. He read them into the record. He put them in front of the committee on national television. And then he sent a formal letter to Fauci with words that had a specific legal weight. These documents appear to contradict your previous testimony before Congress. Contradict your previous testimony. That phrase is not a criticism. It is a predicate. It is what you say before you charge someone with perjury. Here is the part of this story almost no one is discussing. Biden's pardon covers actions taken before January 2023. It does not cover congressional testimony given in June 2024. It does not cover what Fauci said to Congress after the pardon's legal scope ended. And now an investigation is underway into whether Biden was even cognitively present when he signed those pardons. The auto pen question. If those signatures are found to be unauthorized, the legal protection Fauci believed he had may not exist at all. Paul referred Fauci to the Department of Justice, again, for perjury, for obstruction. This time was something he hadn't had in either of his previous two referrals. The emails. 4 years. That is how long this fight lasted. 4 years of Paul being told he was wrong, of being dismissed as a distractor, of watching Fauci sit across the table, answer every question with confidence, and walk away looking like the reasonable man in the room. Meanwhile, Paul was reading, building the case page by page, document request by document request, 4 years of requests, subpoenas, 14 federal agencies, following the money from the NIH to EcoHealth to Wuhan and back. And in September 2025, Paul held up a piece of paper that made all of it simple. The paper didn't require scientific expertise. It didn't require you to understand gain-of-function research or believe Paul's theory about what happened in a Chinese lab. It required something much simpler, the ability to read, and the ability to remember what Fauci had said under oath 14 months earlier. It just required you to read 2 sentences. Please delete this email after you read it. Written by the same man who had sat in front of Congress and said 3 times, that he had never done that. This is what a real document reveal looks like. Not a theory, not a reconstruction. The paper exists, the words are there, and they say exactly what Paul had been saying for 4 years, they would say. The question now is not whether Fauci told people to delete records. 2 emails settle that. The question is whether the pardon holds, whether June 2024 testimony falls inside or outside its scope, whether the auto pen investigation unravels the legal shield entirely, whether 14 agencies under subpoena will produce records that go even further than the 2 emails already surfaced, and whether the man who said no 3 times under oath to 3 different members of Congress will ever have to answer for the words he wrote and then ask someone else to erase. That question is still open. Rand Paul isn't done asking it, because here is what 4 years of this fight actually proved. Not about Fauci, not about COVID, but about how power protects itself in Washington. When someone with enough credentials says no with enough confidence, the room tends to believe them, not because they've verified anything, because the confidence itself becomes the evidence, because the title on the business card does the work that the facts are supposed to do. Paul never accepted that logic. Not in 2021, not in 2024, not now. And in the end, it wasn't a theory that broke through. It was 5 words, written in Fauci's own hand, sent to someone he trusted, asking them to make it disappear. The email survived anyway. He kept reading, he kept requesting, he kept sitting down across the table one more time. And when the room dismissed him, he went back to the documents, because he knew that somewhere in the paper trail, there was a sentence that couldn't be explained. He found it, twice.